On Thursday, the 22nd of September 2022, just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a car pulled up in a quiet Birmingham street. Within minutes, a robbery turned violent. A single knife strike left a man fighting for his life. Years later, on Wednesday, the 31st of January 2024, another man welcomed someone into his flat in Erdington just before midnight. Behind that closed door, something brutal took place. For nearly a week, no one came looking. And when the silence was finally broken, what police found inside told a far darker story. 2 different crimes, 2 different victims. Both carried out in ordinary places, in broad daylight and behind closed doors, by men who thought they could outsmart the system. This is the story of Richard Hopley and Wallace Webb, and how the police exposed the men responsible. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Richard Hopley was 43 years old. To those who knew him best, he was a kind son who had struggled for years with addiction. His dependency had pushed him into a dangerous world, one where debts and disputes were settled with violence. By 2022, he was working as a driver for a Birmingham drug dealer. It was a role that kept him on the edge of the trade, close enough to earn money, but never far from danger. The roots of the conflict that led to his death began with something small, a fake £20 note. Nicholas Stallard, a long-time user, had handed it over to the dealer known locally as Ace. That single act caused a rift between them and set in motion a chain of events that would spiral out of control. Stallard was angry and saw an opportunity for revenge. He and his associate, Paul Hales, aligned themselves with 2 others who had their own motives. At the center was Ayub Khan, 29 years old, known in his area of Harborne. He wasn't a bystander or a minor player. In court, he would later be described as the architect of what was to come. We will talk about this in a few minutes. Alongside him was Mohammed Qasim, just 24 years old at the time. Qasim worked as Khan's drug runner, younger, vulnerable, but armed and willing to act. Stallard and Hales became the enforcers. One in his 40s, the other in his 60s, they brought numbers and presence to the plan. Their role was simple: intimidate, back up the threats, and make sure the dealer they lured in couldn't resist. Ayub Khan had chosen the ground carefully. Underwood Close, a quiet road in Harborne, seemed ordinary, but to him, it offered cover and escape. A narrow alleyway sat close by, an easy route out if the plan went wrong. On Thursday, the 22nd of September 2022, just before 3 p.m, the group put their scheme into motion. The gang believed they could lure Ace to the address and strip him of drugs and cash. The bait was simple, a meeting arranged for business, but the people waiting on the street had no intention of trading. Richard Hopley drove the Volkswagen Passat that afternoon. He was behind the wheel, with Ace in the back. To Richard, it was another ride, another day in a life where his role as a driver placed him close to the shadows of the trade. What he couldn't know was that this trip would put him directly in the crosshairs of 4 men. As the Passat pulled up, Mohammed Qasim made his move. Just 24 years old, he was Khan's drug runner, and on that day, he carried the knife. He slid into the front passenger seat and brandished the blade. His demands were clear: hand over the drugs. The robbery was underway, but chaos followed quickly. Richard, sat just feet away, tried to intervene. He grabbed at Qasim, preventing him from slipping out of the car. In that instant, the threat of robbery escalated into violence. With the blade already drawn, Qasim lashed out. A single strike, delivered with severe force, drove into Richard's chest. It cuts through the rib and heart in one motion. Outside, the other men moved in. Stallard lunged at the car, reaching for the keys in the ignition, trying to stop it from moving. Hales came up alongside and smashed the driver's window, shattering glass across the seat. For a few moments, the vehicle became the center of a desperate struggle. A dealer pinned in the back, his driver wounded, and 3 attackers surrounding them. What began as a planned robbery had, in seconds, turned into something darker and irreversible. The attack lasted only moments, but the damage was already done. Somehow, despite the catastrophic wound, Richard managed to keep the car moving. He pressed the accelerator, dragging Stallard away from the vehicle as it lurched forward. Qasim fled the scene, as well as Hales. Khan, who had held his own knife but never stepped in, stood apart. In seconds, the four men scattered and left the scene. On the other hand, Passat travelled a short distance, swerving across the narrow residential roads. Richard tried to keep control, but the injury and the blood loss was too severe, his grip weakening with every passing second. Around half a mile from the ambush, on Metchley Lane in Harborne, the car left the road and struck a parked Mercedes. Passers-by and residents were the first to notice and came running from nearby houses, and someone dialed 999. Emergency services arrived within minutes. They worked desperately to revive him, but the wound was fatal. The single strike had been delivered with such force that his fifth rib had been severed. Nothing could be done, and he was declared dead at the scene. Police cordoned off the area quickly. The blood on Richard's clothes, the broken window, and the accounts of witnesses pointed to a violent struggle that hadn't ended with the crash. The crash on Metchley Lane left little doubt about what had happened. Within hours, detectives from West Midlands Police's homicide team began piecing together the attack. Detectives began with CCTV. Cameras across Harborne were checked, tracing the movements of Richard's car in the hours leading up to the crash on Metchley Lane. The footage placed the vehicle on Underwood Close, the spot where the ambush unfolded. From there, investigators turned to phone records. Cell site data mapped the locations of key suspects, placing them in the area at the time of the attack. Analysis of calls and messages added another layer, showing clear contact between those later identified as part of the group. CCTV also played a role after the stabbing, with some cameras capturing members of the gang as they fled. These images, combined with the phone data, helped detectives confirm who had been involved. Witness accounts supported the timeline. Piece by piece, the evidence revealed not a spontaneous street fight, but four men acting together in a planned robbery. The first breakthrough came quickly. Within a few days, two men were arrested. Nicholas Stallard and Paul Hales had both been identified as part of the group that confronted the Volkswagen Passat. Mohammed Qasim, the man identified as the one who had delivered the fatal stab wound, fled to Pakistan within days. Ayub Khan, later described in court as the organizer of the plan, also disappeared overseas, believed in Pakistan too. Their sudden absence confirmed to police that the attack had been more than a random assault. It was a carefully conceived robbery that had spiraled into murder. For months, investigators worked quietly. Surveillance continued, financial records were checked, and international alerts were issued. Detectives were certain the two missing men would one day return, and when they did, they would face the same scrutiny as the accomplices already in custody. By the time Qasim arrived back in the UK in late 2023, police were ready. He was arrested at the airport and charged with murder and conspiracy to rob. Months later, Khan also returned, believing he could avoid implication. But we will talk about him later in this video. The case had become a rolling investigation, trials unfolding in stages as each man was caught. But there was one key figure who never appeared on the surface, the dealer known only as Ace, the man whose dispute with Stallard had triggered the plan in the first place. He fled the scene soon after Richard's death and has never been traced. To this day, he remains outside the reach of police and the courts. The first men to face justice were Nicholas Stallard and Paul Hales. They were not accused of delivering the fatal stab wound, but the prosecution made clear that their role in the robbery was active and violent. At Birmingham Crown Court, both were charged with manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. The jury accepted their involvement, and in 2023, they were convicted. Stallard, then 43, was sentenced to 13 years in prison. Hales, aged 65, received 10 years. For Richard's family, it marked the beginning of accountability. though they knew two of the men most responsible were still overseas. The second major trial came months later when Mohammed Kashim returned to the UK. He denied murder, claiming instead that the dealer in the back seat had been the one to lash out with the knife. It was, he argued, an accident that had fatally wounded Richard as the car was attacked. The jury rejected his account. CCTV, phone evidence, and forensic detail placed him at the center of murder. The court ruled that Qasim played a central role and that the knife was not produced by chance. Judge Paul Farah, KC, told him he had intended to kill, even if the attack had not been premeditated. Qasim, then 24, was convicted of murder and conspiracy to rob. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and to serve a minimum of 30 years. Ayub Khan managed to stay beyond the reach of British justice for more than a year. In Pakistan, he married and started a family, building a new life while the men he left behind faced trial. But in September 2023, he returned to the UK, believing he could avoid implication. His gamble would collapse in the courtroom. At trial, Khan attempted to distance himself from the role prosecutors described as central. He presented himself as a man of limited capacity, someone with learning difficulties, low intelligence, and little influence over those around him. Psychological assessments initially appeared to support his claims, with one expert suggesting he had an IQ of just 47, but the deception unraveled by a second psychologist who reviewed his case and concluded he was of average intelligence, fully aware of his actions and the choices he had made. The court was told Khan had deliberately exaggerated his difficulties during the first assessment, attempting to mislead experts and downplay his role in the crime. At one stage, the court even heard comparisons with the 1995 crime thriller The Usual Suspects. In that film, Kevin Spacey's character, Roger Verbal Kint, convinces police he is a harmless, disabled man caught up in events beyond his control. Only at the very end is it revealed he is in fact the elusive criminal mastermind. Like Kint, Khan tried to play the role of the innocent dupe. But unlike the film's character, Khan's illusion was exposed before the jury. The jury was also told that Khan had waited until his co-defendants had been convicted before returning to Britain. Judge Paul Farah, KAC, described him as the architect of the plan and stood as the dominant force among the four. The jury convicted him of murder and conspiracy to rob. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years before parole could even be considered. At the heart of the second case were two very different men whose paths crossed in the early weeks of 2024. Wallace Webb was 65 years old. To his neighbours and those who knew him best, he was remembered as kind-hearted, compassionate, and deeply committed to fairness. He had once served briefly as a local councillor, motivated by a desire to help others in his community. In more recent years, he worked as a chef in a care home, where colleagues said his love of cooking and care for people shone through. His family described him as someone who would do anything for anyone. But behind that public warmth, he lived a quieter, more solitary life. He occupied a flat in Cranley House, a tower block on Baldmore Lake Road in Erdington. He was single, and those closest to him knew that he sometimes turned to Birmingham's gay village and online chat sites to meet people. His brother, who lived abroad, kept in touch regularly, often through Skype calls. The man who would eventually take Wallace's life was 25-year-old Sakandar Hussain. From Erdington himself, Hussein's life looked very different. He came from a low-income background and carried with him a history of instability. Reports from the trial revealed he often used dating apps and websites to meet men. He told investigators that he was bisexual and admitted to having had multiple relationships with older men, some of which included being paid for sex. Hussain later claimed he was vulnerable, presenting himself as someone with a very low IQ and as an individual who had been exploited by others. How exactly the two men came into contact remains guarded. Prosecutors suggested it was through one of these online or social avenues, though neither side provided a definitive account. What is certain is that by the end of January 2024, Hussain and Webb had arranged to meet, an arrangement that would end in violence and tragedy. On the night of Tuesday, the 30th of January 2024, Wallace Webb left his flat just before midnight. CCTV cameras tracked his blue Hyundai as it made its way towards Frederick Road in Gravelly Hill. At around 2:40 a.m., the car flashed its headlights at the corner of Hunton Hill, where a lone man, Sikander Hussain, was waiting. By 2:55 a.m., the car returned to Baldmore Lake Road. CCTV outside Cranley House recorded both men entering the building together. Hussain was seen carrying a backpack. It was the last confirmed footage of Wallace alive. Inside the flat, the timeline was chillingly precise. At 3:07 a.m., Wallace's smart television was activated, with records later showing searches linked to adult content. At 3:37 a.m., his mobile phone was last used. Less than 15 minutes later, at 3:51 a.m., a purchase of £128 was made using his bank card. What Hussain went on to do with those cards we will discuss in a few minutes, but prosecutors later argued that this first transaction must have been carried out inside the flat, while Wallace lay fatally injured, or perhaps already dead. At 3:58 a.m., CCTV picked up a figure leaving Cranley House. The man was carrying both a backpack and an additional bag. Investigators identified him as Hussain. After this moment, Wallace Webb was never seen alive again. For nearly a week, no one in Birmingham knew what had happened inside Cranley House. Wallace Webb lived alone, but he kept in regular contact with his brother. The two would speak twice a week over Skype. When days passed without an answer, concern began to grow. By the sixth day, his brother knew something was wrong and raised the alarm with West Midlands Police. On the morning of the 6th of February, 2024, officers went to Wallace's flat on Baldmore Lake Road. With no response, they forced entry into the high-rise block. What they found inside confirmed those fears. Wallace was discovered lying in his bedroom. He was naked, his body already showing signs of decomposition after several days. Blood patterns inside the flat suggested the violence had taken place there and that Wallace had little chance of escape. In short, the scene was grim, and forensic examination quickly identified multiple stab wounds, the most severe to his neck. The injuries had caused catastrophic blood loss, and experts were able to narrow the time of death to the early hours of 31st January, aligning with the CCTV and digital evidence later presented in court. The flat itself showed no signs of forced entry. There was no ransacking, no indication of a burglary gone wrong. Everything pointed to the killer being someone whom Wallace had willingly let inside. Prosecutors later described the killing as targeted, calculated, and cruel. They told the jury that this was not a random break-in or an unplanned scuffle, but a deliberate act within the safety of Wallace's own home, a space where he should have been secure. From the moment officers stepped out of Cranley House, the case was treated as a homicide. Detectives from the West Midlands Police Homicide Team took over, beginning the urgent task of piecing together who Wallace had been with in his final hours and why his life had ended in such a brutal way. The first and most telling clue was the CCTV footage already discussed. Added to that were Wallace Webb's financial records, which provided a precise timeline of transactions and ultimately solid and undeniable evidence against his killer. While Wallace Webb's body remained undiscovered inside Cranley House, his killer wasted no time making use of what he had taken. Within hours of leaving the flat in the early morning of 31st January, Sikander Hussain began spending. One of his first acts was to set up an online Tesco delivery to his own home. The order, placed using Wallace's bank card, totaled more than £255. It was a bold move. The goods were arranged to be delivered directly to Hussain's own address, leaving behind a clear digital trail. His spree didn't end there. Later that same day, he used the stolen card to buy food at a Big John's takeaway on Sutton New Road in Erdington. In the days that followed, he continued to make purchases at local shops, including Costcutter and other branches of Tesco, spending well over £400 in total. Not content with the cash already obtained, Hussein even went so far as to contact New Day Finance in an attempt to have a block lifted on one of Wallace's credit cards. Investigators later revealed how this showed not only his opportunism, but also his audacity. He believed he could continue draining the accounts without consequence. Perhaps most chillingly, Hussein returned to Cranley House in the days after the killing. Detectives later confirmed his presence back at the tower block, though what he did there remains uncertain. Whether it was an attempt to retrieve something or simply a show of arrogance, it added to the picture of a man who felt untouchable. Throughout this time, Hussein showed no sign of remorse and made no attempt to disguise his involvement. The very actions he took to benefit himself in those days became some of the most important evidence against him. Digital records and CCTV evidence pointed to one name: 25-year-old Sikandar Hussein. On 7th February 2024, just a day after Wallace's body had been discovered, officers moved in and arrested him at an address on Ingleton Road in Birmingham. From the very beginning, Hussein tried to distance himself from the killing. His first explanation was elaborate. He told investigators he had been blackmailed by another man he claimed to have met in a sauna. According to this story, he had only been looking after Wallace's belongings under duress, and others were to blame for the violence. Detectives quickly revealed the flaws in his account, and as the evidence against him mounted, Hussein changed direction. By the time the case reached Birmingham Crown Court, Hussein had admitted to fraud, acknowledging that he had used Wallace's bank and credit cards in the days after his death. But on the charge of murder, he pleaded not guilty. He claimed instead that he had acted in self-defense, insisting that Wallace had attacked him first and that the fatal stabbing was not deliberate. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Prosecutors showed all the evidence that we have already discussed, and the lack of any evidence to support Hussein's version of events. After more than 10 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Hussein was found guilty of murder. He had already admitted fraud by false representation, but the murder conviction sealed his fate. In January 2025, at Northampton Crown Court, he was sentenced. The judge described the crime as heinous, calling Hussein's behavior callous and remorseless. He was ordered to serve life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 21 years before he could even be considered for release. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries. On the cold morning of Saturday, 30th of November 2019, just after 1:30 AM, a quiet street in Bradford, West Yorkshire became the setting for a chain of events that would shock the nation. A man vanished without a trace, leaving behind unanswered questions, a devastated family, and a mystery that grew darker with every passing day. And years earlier, on the evening of Tuesday, 10th May 2011, in another part of Bradford, two friends stepped into a home, unaware that it would be the last time they were ever seen alive. By dawn, their bodies were discovered miles away, brutally beaten and left in a secluded lane. Two crimes, years apart, but each marked by betrayal, brutality, and a desperate search for justice. This is the story of Asghar Badshah and Mohammed Zubair's victims, and how relentless investigations by West Yorkshire Police uncovered the truth behind these chilling murders. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Before we move directly to the murder victim, it's important to step back and understand the background of the man responsible. In the underworld of Bradford's organised crime, one name stood out: Tahir Syed, a 42-year-old man who built a criminal empire as carefully as others might build a business. Syed wasn't just another street dealer, he was at the very top of a supply chain that moved staggering quantities of Class A drugs into the United Kingdom. Between 2016 and 2021, investigators estimate Syed and his associates smuggled in more than 5 tons of heroin and cocaine, with a wholesale value of around £125 million. What made his operation so difficult to detect was the level of sophistication. Each shipment, sometimes weighing up to 200 kilograms, was concealed within lorries carrying frozen chicken. The chicken wasn't intended for sale, it was nothing more than a cover, discarded once the drugs were safely stored. The drugs would be transported from the Netherlands and delivered to an industrial unit in Bradford, rented by Syed. Photos later recovered showed him personally operating a forklift truck, unloading consignments as if he were a warehouse manager running a legitimate business. From there, the packages were distributed further into the network, feeding an insatiable demand across the UK. What ultimately exposed Syed's empire was Operation Venetic, the National Crime Agency's nationwide response to cracking EncroChat. Investigators gained access to thousands of previously secret conversations. For Syed, this was catastrophic. Messages revealed not only his involvement, but his leadership, directing shipments, negotiating sales, and discussing staggering sums of money. The conversations painted a picture of a man who operated with confidence, arrogance even, believing his network was untouchable. The reality was different. While he lived a lifestyle marked by luxury cars, expensive watches, and overseas travel, Syed was already under NCA surveillance by 2019. His trusted lieutenants were already under close watch. We will talk about them in a few minutes. Piece by piece, investigators were mapping the true scale of his operation. By the summer of 2019, the once invisible empire was no longer a secret. Law enforcement had identified Syed as the kingpin of one of the UK's most significant organised crime groups, and it was only a matter of time before that empire began to crumble. On the 17th of September 2019, the carefully constructed empire of Tahir Syed began to crack. That day, investigators tracked two of his trusted men, Yusuf Kara and Imran Khan Ashraf, as they shifted unusually heavy bags between cars in Bradford. Officers decided it was time to act. Ashraf was stopped in Bolton. Hidden in his vehicle was a vacuum-packed bag containing nearly £130,000 in cash, along with 4 mobile phones. Later the same afternoon, Kara was arrested in Bradford. Inside his home, officers made a staggering discovery: 51 kilograms of heroin, tightly packed and ready for distribution. The real breakthrough, however, came from Kara's phone. Stored on it were photographs that would tie Syed directly to the operation, invoices for overseas consignments, images of large sums of money, and even pictures of Syed driving a forklift truck to unload drug shipments. This was no distant boss keeping his hands clean. This was a man immersed in the logistics of trafficking on an industrial scale. The arrests set off a chain reaction. Syed immediately realized the danger. In the days that followed, he moved quickly to liquidate assets. His luxury Mercedes GLE and Nissan GTR were traded for 2 high-end watches worth tens of thousands each. On the 19th of September 2019, just 2 days after Kara's arrest, Syed vanished from the country. It was a calculated retreat, but it also showed his fear. For years, he had appeared untouchable, confident that his empire was too well hidden to bring down. Syed's escape would buy him some time, but it would also set the stage for an even more shocking crime. One that revealed just how far he was willing to go when he believed his money, reputation, and authority were under threat. Two months after fleeing the UK, Syed was back. It was late November 2019 when he quietly returned to Bradford, not to rebuild his empire, but to deal with a crisis far closer to home. Around £600,000 in cash, drug money entrusted to the family, had gone missing. For Syed, this wasn't just a financial setback. It was about credibility. In his world, a missing fortune threatened his authority more than any police raid ever could. His suspicion fixed on one man, his own uncle, Asghar Badshah, a 39-year-old bus driver known for his warmth and generosity. Badshah was no career criminal. He worked regular shifts, earning a modest living. But he had been drawn into Syed's orbit when asked to safeguard money, unaware of the scale of the risk he was taking. When the cash disappeared, Syed became convinced that his uncle had either taken it or knew exactly where it had gone. Syed didn't move straight to violence. Instead, he turned to a different method, the lie detector test. In November, he arranged for Badshah to undergo polygraph examinations, first at a hotel in Bradford, then at another in Liverpool. The results came back unfavorably, feeding Syed's growing paranoia. To him, it was proof of betrayal. The lie detector sessions marked a turning point. They turned suspicion into certainty in Syed's mind and shifted his thinking from recovery to punishment. In the early hours of 30 November 2019, Asghar Badshah's life was violently torn away from him. At around 1:30 a.m., he was abducted from his mother's home on Mayo Road, Bradford, bundled into a Mercedes and driven out of the city. It was not strangers who came for him, but men acting under the orders of his own nephew, Tahir Syed. We will talk about them later in this video. The destination was a disused branch of Yorkshire Bank on Commercial Street in Batley. Closed since 2016, it looked deserted from the outside, but its basement vault was about to become the site of a brutal interrogation. For Syed, this was the place where he believed he would finally extract the truth about the missing £600,000. Once inside, the violence began. Over the course of more than 11 hours, Badshah was struck repeatedly with blunt objects. A later post-mortem revealed at least 48 separate injuries across his body, to his head, torso, arms and legs. The ferocity of the attack left no doubt about its intent. This was torture, designed to break him down and force a confession. Syed demanded to know where the money was. But no answers came. The beating went on through the night, each blow delivered with a cold determination to defend reputation at any cost. By morning, the interrogation had turned fatal. Badshah succumbed to catastrophic blunt force injuries, his body battered beyond recovery. Syed had not found the money, but what he left behind in that vault was only death, and the beginning of a desperate attempt to cover up what had been done inside those locked doors. The body was wrapped in cloth and placed on a shelving unit in the basement, hidden away from sight. To make discovery even less likely, a false wall was built to block off the staircase that led down to the vault. From the outside, the building appeared empty, its doors locked with sealed windows, but inside a man's remains were entombed, deliberately hidden in the dark. For the family, the days that followed were filled with fear and confusion. On the 4th of December 2019, 4 days after the abduction, Badshah was reported missing. His relatives pleaded for information, unable to understand why a man known for his kindness and regular routines had simply vanished. Syed added to the pain. He reassured the family that Badshah was safe, claiming he was comfortable and well. In reality, he knew his uncle had already been dead for days. His lies were part of a wider strategy to buy time, to maintain an illusion, while police inquiries edged closer to the truth. Detectives with West Yorkshire Police's Homicide and Major Inquiry team launched an intensive search. Inquiries spread across Bradford, Batley and beyond, as officers pieced together the last known movements of the missing man. The case was treated as a kidnap, but concern was growing that it would end as something far worse. On 29th of December 2019, nearly a month after Badshah's disappearance, officers forced entry into the abandoned Yorkshire Bank in Batley. In the basement vault, they found what the family had dreaded but suspected: his body, battered, wrapped, and concealed. As detectives built their case, it became clear that Tahir Syed had not acted alone. The abduction and concealment of Asghar Badshah involved others, each playing a role in carrying out or supporting the plan. One of the central figures was Chaisar Shah, a 40-year-old from Bradford. Phone records and surveillance placed him in direct contact with Syed during the days surrounding the abduction. Detectives concluded that Shah was one of the men physically involved in taking Badshah from his home in the early hours of the 30th of November. He was later charged not only with kidnap, but also with manslaughter, reflecting the part he played in the events that led to Badshah's death. Alongside him, two others were drawn into the conspiracy: Liam Buckley from Berkshire and Sabah Shahmaradi from Surrey. Both were outsiders geographically, yet communications data showed their links to the Bradford group. Messages exchanged before and after the abduction suggested knowledge of the plan to seize Badshah and awareness of Syed's determination to recover the missing cash. Their involvement was not in the violence itself, but in the agreement to make the kidnapping possible. Detectives moved against them once the EncroChat material and phone analysis tied them into the conspiracy. Another figure, Wajid Hussain, was also traced through call records and financial evidence. Though his role was smaller, investigators found enough to show he had been part of the conspiracy to kidnap. His presence in communications around the time of the abduction placed him within the circle of trust Syed had relied upon. Finally, attention turned to Syed's wife, Sobiya Syed. Detectives following the money uncovered her role in handling criminal property linked to the operation. While she had not taken part in the abduction, she was implicated in attempts to manage the proceeds and protect the family's financial interests in the aftermath. By mid-2020, West Yorkshire Police had gathered enough to charge each of them. Arrests were made in Bradford, Berkshire and Surrey, bringing the wider conspiracy into the open. Two days after the murder, Tahir Syed was gone. On the 2nd of December 2019, he slipped out of the UK once more, this time determined not to return. His route through Europe was fragmented, designed to make tracing difficult. Records later showed him travelling through the Netherlands, Albania and Kosovo before eventually settling in Turkey. He used a false North Macedonian passport, a forged identity that allowed him to cross borders and rent accommodation without raising alarms. Despite being on the run, Syed refused to let go of the business that had made him powerful. Even abroad, he continued to direct shipments. In July 2020, Dutch authorities intercepted one of those consignments, a lorry containing 155 kilograms of cocaine hidden among legitimate goods. The seizure demonstrated that even while Syed was wanted for murder, he was still orchestrating large-scale importations. Back in the UK, detectives from West Yorkshire Police and the National Crime Agency worked with international partners to track his movements. The scale of the search turned it into a global manhunt. Syed might have thought that his false identity and constant movement gave him an advantage, but his network left traces: communications, financial transfers, the fingerprints of organised crime that investigators across Europe were trained to follow. On the 11th of November 2021, Turkish authorities finally closed in. Syed was detained in Turkey and placed into custody, but his fight to avoid justice was far from over. What followed was a 2-year battle against extradition, with Syed resisting every legal move to return him to the UK. Only in April 2024, after years of persistence from British prosecutors and cooperation from Turkish officials, was Syed finally extradited back to the UK. By the summer of 2025, the long investigation reached its final act inside Leeds Crown Court. After a 5-week trial, the jury returned unanimous verdicts. Tahir Syed was guilty of murder, conspiracy to kidnap, and major drug importation conspiracies. He had already admitted conspiracy to possess criminal property. On the 13th of June 2025, he stood before the judge to hear his fate. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years and 154 days, taking into account the time he had already spent in custody following his extradition. The wider conspiracy did not end with Syed. His associates were also brought to justice. Kaisar Shah, 40, admitted manslaughter, conspiracy to kidnap, and handling criminal property. He was sentenced to 18 years. Liam Buckley, 38, and Sabah Shahmaradi, 39, admitted conspiracy to kidnap. Each received 7 years and 2 months. Wajid Hussein, 43, also admitted conspiracy to kidnap. He was jailed for 4 years and 2 months. Subayya Syed, 41, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess criminal property. She was given 2 years, suspended for 2. In the spring of 2011, tensions inside a quiet Bradford household began to boil beneath the surface. Mohammed Zubair, a local taxi driver, lived at Heath Terrace in Barker End with his wife, Kainat Bibi, and his mother, Arab Sultana. Outwardly, it was an ordinary family home, but Zubair had discovered a truth he could not ignore. His wife was conducting an affair with Ahmadin Syed Kiel, a 35-year-old Afghan electrician from London who was married with 7 children. On the evening of 10th May 2011, that discovery collided with reality. Kyle travelled to Bradford with his friend, Imran Khan, a 27-year-old labourer from the city. The 2 men arrived at Zubair's house expecting little more than a conversation. Out of respect, they removed their shoes before stepping into the living room. Neither man could have imagined what awaited them inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. Zubair was waiting, not with words, but with weapons. He armed himself with a hammer or possibly a dumbbell bar, an object capable of delivering lethal force. What followed was described later in court as a ferocious and brutal assault. Kyle was struck at least 6 times to the head. Some blows came even after he had already been knocked unconscious, the force so severe it drove fragments of bone into his brain. His friend Khan fared no better. He suffered at least 13 strikes, desperately trying to fend off the attack as it rained down. The sheer violence left both men fatally injured on the living room sofa where they had sat only minutes earlier. Once the attack was over, Zubair set about hiding the evidence. He attempted to wipe away the blood that had spattered across the ceiling, walls and furniture, but no amount of cleaning could erase the scale of the violence. He then turned to disposal. With chilling practicality, he loaded both bodies into his Volkswagen Transporter taxi. That night, he drove out to New Lane near the village of Tong, a secluded stretch of road just outside Bradford. In the darkness, he dumped the bodies by the roadside before vanishing back into the city. It was a temporary concealment at best. In the early hours of 11 May, passing motorists made a grim discovery. The bodies of Ahmadin Syed Kiel and Imran Khan, battered, lifeless and discarded in the shadows of the countryside. The killings were savage in their execution, personal in their motive, and calculated in their aftermath. What began with a secret affair had erupted into double murder, an act that would soon pull in not only Zubair, but members of his own family. In the aftermath of the double murder, Mohammed Zubair wasted no time in securing his escape. Within hours of abandoning the bodies, he turned to the 2 people closest to him for help: his mother, Arab Sultana, and his wife, Kainat Bibi. On the 11th of May 2011, the day after the killings, Sultana booked and paid for her son's ticket out of the country. The destination was Pakistan. By that evening, Zubair had boarded a flight, vanishing beyond the reach of British police. It was a calculated move, one that revealed not only his determination to evade justice, but also the willingness of his family to support him in doing so. But even as he fled, police were already closing in. The scene was immediately sealed off by West Yorkshire Police. Forensic teams combed through the stretch of road, collecting tyre marks, blood traces and soil samples. Tyre marks, blood traces, and the positioning of the bodies all told investigators they had been transported and dumped deliberately. Detectives worked backwards. Phone records and witness statements placed both victims at Heath Terrace in Barker End on the evening of the 10th of May. That house belonged to Mohammed Zubair. When police spoke with his family, alarm bells rang. Kainat Bibi told detectives her husband was on pilgrimage in Morocco, but airline records showed that Arab Sultana had purchased a ticket to Pakistan for her son the very next day. The contradiction marked the first clear sign of a cover-up. A search warrant for Heath Terrace confirmed those suspicions. The living room bore signs of a hurried clean-up. Blood had been wiped from the walls, ceiling and furniture, but forensic testing revealed extensive traces invisible to the eye. DNA confirmed the blood belonged to both victims. The spatter pattern showed that the attack had happened right there in the living room, the sofa still bearing marks of violence. Attention turned to Zubair's Volkswagen transporter cab. The vehicle had also been wiped down, but swabs taken from hidden areas revealed more DNA traces of the victims. It was the link between the attack inside the house and the disposal in Tong. With the forensic picture now clear, detectives widened the investigation. Zubair was out of reach in Pakistan, but those who had helped him remained in Bradford. His mother, Arab Sultana, was charged with assisting an offender. In 2013, she was jailed for 3 years and 9 months for her role in ensuring his escape. His wife, Kainat Bibi, was convicted of perverting the course of justice, her lies to police costing her 20 months in prison. Others connected to the crime also faced trial. In 2012, Sabir Hussain, a fellow minicab driver and close associate of Zubair, was accused of taking part in the attack at Heath Terrace. Prosecutors argued that while he may not have struck the fatal blows, his presence and actions had directly contributed to the deaths of 2 men. The jury acquitted him of murder but convicted him of manslaughter, recognizing his role in the events that night. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. For the families of Ahmadin Syed Kiel and Imran Khan, these convictions brought some relief, but they did not deliver full justice. The man who had wielded the weapon was still thousands of miles away, shielded by distance and determined to resist every effort to bring him back. For West Yorkshire Police, the case was far from closed. What lay ahead was a pursuit across borders, a battle for extradition that would test the limits of international cooperation. For more than 2 years after the murders, Mohammed Zubair remained a fugitive. That changed in November 2013. Acting on intelligence shared through international channels, Pakistani authorities arrested Zubair. It was a breakthrough for West Yorkshire Police, who had never given up the pursuit. Yet the arrest was only the beginning of a long and arduous process. Zubair refused to return willingly. He launched a series of legal challenges in Pakistan, determined to resist extradition. His appeals wound their way through the courts, at one stage reaching the country's Supreme Court. British prosecutors and detectives worked closely with counterparts in Islamabad, navigating the absence of a formal extradition treaty between the UK and Pakistan. The case became more than just the pursuit of one man. It was a test of international cooperation. For the first time in over a decade, Pakistan agreed to return a suspect to the UK. In May 2016, after years of legal wrangling, Mohammed Zubair was finally extradited. Six years after the murders, Mohammed Zubair finally stood before a jury. His trial opened at Bradford Crown Court in 2017. The prosecution presented the case in stark terms. This was no spontaneous outburst, they argued, but a calculated, cold-blooded double murder. In the dock, Zubair attempted to shift blame. He claimed that his associate, Sabir Hussain, had been solely responsible for the killings. But the jury rejected this version of events in the light of forensic evidence from the living room, and the taxi linked directly back to Zubair. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was returned. Mohammed Zubair was found guilty of both murders. When he returned to court for sentencing, the judge described the crimes as deliberate and merciless. It was one of the heaviest sentences handed down at the time in Bradford Crown Court. The sentence was life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 32 years before parole could even be considered. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries. Thursday, February 9th, 2023. 8:45 p.m. Pembroke Road in Erith was just like any other residential street. quiet and tucked away from the city's noise. A white Mini Countryman rolled down the road, 3 friends inside. Moments later, headlights emerged in the distance. Just a vehicle coming head-on. The silence of the street was about to be replaced with chaos. What happened next left neighbors shaken, a young man dying on the pavement, and 2 others running for their lives. But uncovering the truth wouldn't be simple. What followed was a long, complex investigation, a trail that led deep into London's criminal underworld. This is the story of Kai McGinley's final night, and how a calculated ambush on a quiet London street exposed a deadly plan and brought down 7 men. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Before headlines called him the victim, before his name echoed through courtrooms and news reports, Kai McGinley was simply a 24-year-old man from Southwark, South London. He was a son, a brother, a friend, and for those who knew him best, a vibrant soul with dreams that reached beyond the streets where he grew up. Kai was known in his community as an aspiring rap artist. He wrote music with emotion and purpose, often scribbling lyrics late into the night. Friends and family described Kai as caring, humble, and deeply protective of those he loved. His sister Kelly said he had a way of making people feel seen, even when they felt invisible. "My brother will never be just another statistic," she told the court. "He was our world, and we were his." Though his life was tragically cut short, Kai wasn't a figure on the sidelines of life. He was deeply woven into the social fabric of his area. He had friends and ambition. He had flaws too, as do most young men trying to navigate life in the overlap of ambition and environment. Some reports and prosecutor Brian O'Neill KC told the court Kai's murder was linked to drug dealing disputes in the same area. Still, nothing in his past could have justified what happened to him that night. That's what makes this case so difficult to swallow for many. Kai wasn't caught in the crossfire. He was the target. His final words, spoken to a friend just seconds before he collapsed, reveal the horror and confusion of someone who never expected to die that night. Their plan was set. What came next was a night Erith would never forget. The men behind the ambush were not faceless shadows, though they tried hard to be. They were 7 individuals bound by proximity, criminal ties, and a shared readiness to carry out violence. All of them were dressed in black that night, their faces hidden behind balaclavas, moving with a chilling synchronicity. But beneath the masks were very different profiles, some barely out of their teenage years, others older and more entrenched in the life they had chosen. At 34, Bradley Reeves stood apart in age from the younger men around him. He lived nearby in Erith, where he was a familiar presence. Reeve was with the armed group, ready to join the attack. Alongside him was 21-year-old Enrico Spahju, his youth belying the decisiveness of his actions. Spahju was one of the men who shouldered a shotgun, prepared to unleash its power at close range. Next to him was 21-year-old Anthony Walder from Bexley, who worked with Spahju as they moved in on the trapped Mini. Another key figure was 25-year-old Kai Osibodu, linked to Riverdale Road in Erith. He was tied directly to the moment that set everything in motion, the deliberate ramming of the Mini. Whether behind the wheel or acting as support inside the Freelander, his role was to ensure the victims had nowhere to run. With him were 3 others, all younger. 19-year-old Jaylis Gangjira from Woodfield Close, and another 19-year-old Charlie Braben from Byron Drive joined in after the crash. The last was 22-year-old Connor Brooks from Horser Road, who helped carry out the ambush once the Mini was stopped. 7 men and a plan that looked anything but random. Every move on Pembroke Road suggested a purpose. But why would so many young men come together for something this violent? What message were they trying to send? And what had Kai done to deserve it? The answers lay not just in the night of the attack, but in the days and dealings that came before. Behind the violence on Pembroke Road was not a random act of rage, but a dispute that had been simmering in the shadows of southeast London's drug trade. Prosecutors later confirmed that both Kai McGinley and several of the men who hunted him down were connected to the same world of dealing in the Erith and Bexley areas. It was a volatile market where territory meant profit and grudges were not forgotten. In that context, the decision was made. Retribution for Kai should not be a warning, not a beating, but death. The attack carried all the hallmarks of advanced planning. This was not 7 men suddenly thrown together. They chose 2 vehicles, each with a clear role to play. We will discuss the role of each in a few minutes. Every step showed coordination. Witnesses would later recall the chaos of black-clad figures moving with precision. Even their escape had been considered. After firing the shots, the men didn't scatter into the night. Instead, they regrouped, retreating into familiar ground. Detectives would later learn that they hid in the garage of Bradley Reeve, one of the ringleaders, while a family member was called to pick them up. It was a chillingly ordinary detail in the middle of a calculated murder. At its heart, the attack sent a message. A turf war had been marked with a deliberate show of violence. Kai was not simply to be hurt or warned off. He was to be erased in a way that would echo across the local streets and drug corners. To understand the scale of what unfolded, we need to walk through that night in sequence, every movement, every sound, every shot. The white Mini Countryman driven by Kai McGinley was actually a stolen vehicle wearing false plates. But for the 3 young men inside, it was their means of getting around that night. Beside him was his friend Bill Burton, while Norman Samura rode in the back. To anyone looking from the pavement, it was an ordinary scene. 3 friends heading down a suburban road. Then, from the opposite direction, a silver Land Rover Freelander, lights switched off, was bearing straight toward them. Following closely behind was a grey Peugeot 307, almost shadowing the first car's movements. At first, Kai tried to make sense of it. Was it just a reckless driver, or what? He attempted to move the Mini slightly left, giving space for the Land Rover to pass. But the vehicle did not slow. Instead, it accelerated. In one brutal moment, the Freelander smashed head-on into the Mini at full speed. The Mini spun violently across the road. Metal tore, glass shattered, airbags burst. Inside, the 3 friends were thrown around. Bill later said he felt dazed, almost knocked out. Norman was jolted in the back. The car came to a stop, badly damaged, leaving them trapped in shock. From both the cars, black-clad figures emerged. They moved fast, as though this moment had been rehearsed. At least 4 of them advanced on the Mini. 2 had shotguns in hand, which we discussed earlier. Residents later told police they heard a burst of 4 to 5 deafening blasts, each echoing down the narrow street. The attackers fired at close range into the car. Pellets tore through glass and metal. One blast tore into the driver's side, striking Kai in the back. The shot penetrated his lung and heart, a wound no paramedic could reverse. Another round slammed into the passenger side window, sending shards spraying over Bill, who by now had thrown himself into the footwell, pressed between the glove box and the floor. Inside the car, the violence didn't stop with the shots. In those last moments, Kai was still alive, but fading. Bill remembered hearing him say, "Bill, I'm in trouble." When Bill turned, he saw his friend lifting a hand, blood spilling between his fingers. Seconds later, Kai collapsed, and that was the end. The attackers didn't stay. The Land Rover, wrecked from the crash, was abandoned on the street. The masked men used a second car to flee from the scene, which sped away into the night. Within minutes, Pembroke Road was left in silence again. One neighbor rushed into the road carrying towels. She pressed them against Kai's chest, her hands becoming bloodied as she tried to stem the flow. Others shouted for the police and ambulance. By the time emergency services arrived, Pembroke Road was in chaos. Police taped off the scene. Paramedics fought to keep Kai alive. At 9:31 p.m., they pronounced him dead. Detectives arriving just minutes after paramedics began their desperate attempts to save Kai found a street transformed into a crime scene. The white Mini stood crumpled at an angle, airbags hanging loose, and beside it, the evidence of something far more sinister than a crash. Kai was confirmed dead at the roadside, what we have already covered earlier. Later, post-mortem confirmed the wound was consistent with a close-range shotgun blast. On the road around the Mini, officers recovered spent cartridge fragments, each logged as evidence by the forensic team working under portable lights. Just meters away, the wrecked Land Rover Freelander stood abandoned, its engine crushed from the force of the deliberate ramming. Inside, investigators found traces that tied it back to known associates of the men who had carried out the ambush. This car was the key to unlocking the route of the attackers. Inside the Freelander, more was found than just fingerprints and DNA. Officers recovered items consistent with the violence of the attack, fragments of shotgun cartridges, traces that would later match those used in the shooting, and even bladed weapons including a machete carried as part of the group's arsenal. Every item was bagged, catalogued, and became part of the growing case file. Beyond physical evidence, detectives began speaking to residents who had rushed to their windows or doors. The consistency of their accounts reinforced the picture of a coordinated ambush carried out in seconds. At the same time, officers turned to the digital trail. Mobile phone data and cell tower tracking began to highlight patterns. Numbers associated with some of the suspects were shown to be in the area at the time of the shooting. Later, detectives cross-referencing this with movement before and after the attack proved vital in narrowing down the list of possible names. Piece by piece, the evidence started to close in. But the clearest breakthrough didn't come from fingerprints, cartridges, or even phone records. It came from something harder to outrun: the unblinking eye of CCTV. Working through hours of footage, investigators first plotted the Mini Countryman's journey that night. They were able to track the white car as it moved through the local streets, showing its approach to Pembroke Road before the fatal collision. More importantly, at some points, the same cameras picked up the convoy of the attackers as well, which shows they were properly following them. Their movements were not random. Frame by frame, detectives mapped how the two vehicles coordinated, boxing the Mini into a trap. After the shooting, the lenses told another story. Later sequences traced that Peugeot to a familiar location, the garage belonging to Bradley Reeve, which we have already covered. The grainy images showed men disappearing inside, their outlines, clothing and movements matching descriptions from eyewitnesses, as well as the CCTVs from the street. When cross-referenced with the CCTV routes, the evidence lined up. Every camera angle, every signal ping, every trace inside the abandoned car. One piece of evidence on its own might have raised questions. Together, they drew a map. The masked figures who had stepped out for the violence were no longer faceless. Piece by piece, their identities began to emerge. For Kai's mother, Lena McGinley, the murder of her 24-year-old son was more than a headline. In court, she described him as, "Kai was my youngest child and only son. My boy Kai was 24 years old when he went out one day and didn't come home." Her words carried the weight of a life interrupted, not by chance, but by deliberate violence. After his death, Lena found a half-written rap in his belongings, verses he had never finished. She spoke about how it broke her to see the lines cut short, as though his voice had been silenced mid-sentence. The loss rippled beyond the McGinley family. Online, friends and community members shared tributes, calling him an angel and a brother in soul. Some recalled his humility, others his energy, and many simply expressed disbelief that someone so young and vibrant had been taken so suddenly. In the days that followed, flowers, candles, and handwritten notes appeared along Pembroke Road, a makeshift shrine to mark the spot where his life had ended. Strangers and loved ones alike stopped to lay bouquets, a quiet gesture of respect and sorrow for a young man who had become a symbol of loss. By early spring, the investigation had sharpened to a point. Met launched a series of raids across southeast London, determined to bring in all 7 men linked to the ambush. The first to fall was Bradley Reeve, tracked through the garage footage. DNA inside the Land Rover tied him further to the crime. Police picked him up at his home in Erith, Enrico Sparhue and Anthony Walder, both 21, were traced through DNA and digital evidence. They were arrested in coordinated operations not long after Reeve. Kai Osibodu, 25, was identified through his connection to the Freelander that delivered the ramming blow. He was detained following surveillance in his own neighborhood. For the younger men, Jarlis Selby Gangara, Connor Brooks, and Charlie Braben, it was the web of CCTV and phone data that closed around them. Each was placed at the scene and their movements syncing with the group. Brooks and Selby Gangara were arrested in the months that followed, while Braben was charged later after further evidence confirmed his role. Despite extensive searches, the firearms used that night were never recovered, leaving investigators to rely on ballistic fragments and other supporting evidence. One by one, between March and September 2023, the 7 were taken off the streets. What had begun as a masked ambush in the dark was now unfolding in the open, each man facing the consequences of his role. The case reached the Old Bailey in 2024, where prosecutors presented the evidence gathered over months of investigation that we have already discussed earlier. The jury agreed. One by one, the 7 men were convicted, their roles and levels of involvement reflected in the verdicts. Bradley Reeve, aged 34, was found guilty of murder and grievous bodily harm. He was ordered to serve life in prison with a minimum term of 33 years. Alongside him, Enrico Sparhue, 21, and Anthony Walder, 21, were also convicted of murder. Each was sentenced to life, with a minimum of 29 years before parole could be considered. Kai Osibodu, 25, tied to the Land Rover that rammed the Mini off the road, was also convicted of murder. He was handed a life sentence with a minimum of 30 years. For the younger defendants, the court accepted that their roles were secondary but still vital to the ambush. Connor Brooks, 22, was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Jarlis Gangara, 19, was given 9.5 years for manslaughter, while Charlie Braben, also 19, was sentenced to 9 years. In total, the 7 men received more than 150 years of prison time. What do you think about the case and the sentences handed down? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you want more raw UK crime stories like this, subscribe to UK Crime Documentaries and hit the bell so you don't miss the next case.